travel ban and some of her other ideas for business and international business. So please stick around. We will be right back. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. Thank you so much, Rochelle, once again for joining. I was looking back at the episode we did at first. I think you were episode number 7, talking about your books and your consulting firm and everything. And this time we're going to be talking more about your articles and some of your other ideas. Thank you so much for joining once again.
Yeah, happy to be here. Yes.
That's wonderful. So I was listening. First, let's briefly introduce your consulting group. Would you mind?
Oh, certainly. So, Japan Intercultural Consulting is my own firm. I'm the founder, and I have a team here in Japan, team in the US, team in Europe, and people in Latin America and also other parts of Asia. And we work with Japanese firms' global operations and global firms that are doing business in Japan. We do a lot of cross-cultural training, team buildings, executive coaching, things that help bridge the cultures.
Yeah, wonderful. And I love your logo. Your logo is so beautiful. It looks like a tama ball, but also the three parts collaborating. Such a beautiful logo.
Thank you. Thanks. I wanted it to look like a Japanese kamon family crest.
Yeah, very pretty. I love it. So in July and then again in October, you wrote articles on the Japan Times about the travel ban. Should we just dive in and start talking about that first?
Sure. I've written. I've lost track at this point. Is it 4? Is it 5? It seems like every month this is what I've been writing about because this issue just is not going away. And so, if you sort of trace back the history, when the country closed down in the spring, Japan said that if you weren't Japanese, you could not come to Japan, basically. And there was some people who had left before a certain date, I believe it was April 2nd, could return. But a lot of people were stuck outside of the country and were not able to return, even though they were residents or even permanent residents. They'd gotten the permanent residency, but still that didn't get them treated the same as Japanese citizens. And so there were a lot of people who, were stuck in that. Then we had an easing of that, and permanent residents and long-term residents were able to return. But then you had the issue of students were not able to come to start their classes, and business people were not able to come to start their new jobs. And this created a tremendous burden on, of course, universities and the students, as well as people who are in limbo waiting to start new positions. And so that got addressed. But the way it got addressed is problematic, and that's what my most recent article is about. So if you are a new entrant under what's called the residence plan, that you have to have your sponsoring organization sign a really complex pledge that says that they certify that you're coming to Japan for something that's urgent and absolutely necessary. And you have to provide really concrete reasons for that. And I've talked to people who have gotten rejected because the statement was too vague. And they have to commit that you're going to follow a certain group of health reporting procedures, which one of the key ones only is done in Japanese. And so that means the company has to be kind of your nanny if you're someone who's coming to Japan and you don't speak Japanese already. And so it's very complicated. And at the end of this form, it says that if the company is deemed to have not handled this well and there's some problem, that they could have their name published in the list, which in Japan, where shame is a big thing, that's a very bad thing. And also, they could find it difficult to bring people to Japan in the future. So what's happening is a lot of organizations just don't even want to deal with this form and don't want to sign it. So they're telling people who have been waiting already to come start their new jobs to wait longer for some unspecified period. Some students have been told, we don't want you to come because the school doesn't want to sign it. Then there are other people who were already here and wanting to bring their spouse or family members to Japan. And the organization has to sign for those people as well. And the organizations are either hesitating or outright refusing to sign the pledge for people's spouses. So people are in Japan and they can't bring their spouse. And there are people who've been separated for months because of this. So it's not really been handled in a particularly good way. There's also another issue for both returning residents and new residents who are coming to Japan now have to take a PCR test within 72 hours of departure and have a form that's specified by the Japanese government filled out and signed. And that doesn't really sound so bad, except that when you start to think about it, in a lot of places in the world, they don't share results in English. They don't share results on paper. A lot of places just do it by email. A lot of places don't have a doctor who's there who can sign the form the way that Japan requires. In a lot of places, you can't easily get access to a doctor. And then, of course, with the tests, Japan is requiring a certain type of test, which is not the one used everywhere. It's requiring these 72 hours, and a lot of places don't have labs that can turn it around that quickly. And also, a lot of places are not doing testing for people who don't have symptoms. So there are people who are stuck outside of Japan simply because they can't do this test.
Yeah.
And they're, they've got a place in Japan, and they're paying rent, and they have a life to come back to, and they can't return.
Yeah, there's just 2 points I want to make right now. From your Twitter feed, someone was saying they were in the States. They were able to find a company where they could do the test. It was $200 to get the turnaround. I saw other people in your Twitter feed saying they were able to do it in London, but then some people saying they couldn't do it in Edinburgh. Some people in Canada saying they couldn't get the turnaround in time. And then in Japan recently, there was news that, of course, in Japan, they don't do the test for people who are asymptomatic either. And they're trying to change that rule. So there's just very typical, in my experience, to Japan bureaucracy. One side is saying something, the other side says something else, and it becomes almost impossible to move forward in any proactive way, right?
Well, it's definitely a typical Japanese bureaucracy kind of thing to be having it be so basically self-centered approach. And one of the experts I interviewed for the article used the term in Japanese ore-sama, which is sort of like, the world revolves around me kind of thing. And he said, well, it's an ore-sama thing where the Japanese government is expecting places to work the way it expects them to work, and that's not necessarily practical or reasonable for a lot of people.
Yeah. Is that Iwata-san? I've got this quote right here from your article. Kentaro Iwata says, basically, COVID is not judging anyone's nationality. So a Japanese citizen who can go to and from Japan freely versus a foreign permanent resident who cannot go to and from freely, COVID does not differentiate between those two people, right?
Right, exactly. Well, that's the whole sort of underlying all the complicated things that I just said. None of those things are being requested of Japanese nationals. And so you can have someone who's a permanent resident who's lived in Japan for 30 years, and their spouse is Japanese, and they're both outside of Japan, and the spouse can enter Japan with no problem, and the 30-year permanent resident can't and has to do this test, which isn't necessarily available, right? And so there's a question of, why does that make sense? It really doesn't, right?
Yeah. Louise just joined. Louise Puppy, thanks for joining, Louise. She says, hello, girls. Nice to see you online. I think there's so many in terms of your business experience with intercultural consulting, businesses in Japan, businesses, Japanese businesses abroad, Japanese people working abroad, international people working in Japan. I think you have a really unique, important perspective on this, and you can kind of see the workings of the problem because of your experience. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, yeah. Well, the thing is that my career is as someone who looks at Japanese organizations and looks at how they act culturally. And so it's been very interesting to look at this and everything else related to the coronavirus from that lens of what does it show us about Japanese organizations? What does it show us about Japanese culture? And it's been very revealing and fascinating. Just I think as the same is true for many other cultures, you learn a lot about a culture when it's under pressure, right?
Yeah, definitely. I thought it was really interesting to look at this problem in relation to the labor shortage and then the international student problems that I was seeing come up in other news stories. So, for example, there are international students in Japan now who could not go back to their home country because of travel bans. And they lost their place at the university because their funding from their families abroad stopped because the family has stopped working.
Mm.
So they were kind of stuck in limbo. And then a new policy has just been made. They can work 28 hours a week. If you're working for 1,000 yen an hour,
That's going to be
um,
barely enough to live on, is it?
not,
Yes.
not and so I came across researching different articles. I kept coming across what I would term as magic numbers. Why 28 hours a week limit? And then we have the famous 72 hours, which comes up twice.
Right, right,
72 hours before you fly, you have to get a negative test.
right.
Again, 72 hours comes up again for the new business trip rule that is just
Mm.
passing. If you come to Japan and you stay less than 72 hours, you don't need to be quarantined for 2 weeks.
What
Why?
is it about 72 hours? There's no scientific basis for it that anyone's been able to share with me. Yeah,
Yeah,
so why that number? Why not 96 hours? If they could have 96 hours on the pre-departure test, it would make it so much easier for people, right?
definitely. A lot
And
of,
is and is and
yeah,
is that going to time? And it was another day going to make a difference in terms of whether someone's safe or not? Not really, right?
yeah. Absolutely. So, I mean, I think, yeah, they're just, it's kind of random. I haven't heard any scientific evidence that says if you stay less than 72 hours, you're less risk of spreading the virus. I haven't read anything like that. And 72 hours for getting the test, but that's only for foreign nationals who coming back to Japan. That's
Right,
not
right, yes,
not
right, right.
Japanese people, right?
No,
And
no,
then
no. Japanese people have no such pre-departure requirement. Japanese have to take a test when they arrive in Japan, but the non-Japanese do too. So basically, non-Japanese are having two tests.
yeah.
And actually, this is something I couldn't fit in the article, but when I talked to Iwata Sensei about this, he said, and because I asked him, well, is it really helpful to have two tests? He said, look, it's kind of the same thing. Let's say you're leaving on a trip and you're going to check like your gas line and make sure that it's okay before you leave. It's kind of like how many times do you go back and check that? It's not like you can say there's the ideal number of times to check it. It's like so there's not like you can really quantify that, right?
Yeah. In terms of the labor shortage, I mean, this has been going on for years, and I'm showing data right now from Nippon.com, showing that in 2019 the data was looking pretty dire. What can we expect from data from 2020? It's going to be the worst ever, right?
For labor shortage.
Yeah.
Well, it's going to depend on the areas, and so what we're seeing is a very uneven thing happening. I mean, with the coronavirus, there's a lot of people who are out of work who's lost their jobs, particularly a lot of contingent workers, a lot of female workers. On the other hand, you have some of these industries that have been really reliant on the low-priced foreign trainees to be doing kind of manual labor in agricultural and low-level manufacturing. And those areas are hurting because they're dependent on bringing a lot of people in who aren't coming in now. And so they don't have people to, shuck the oysters or whatever the kind of the manual things that you would be doing, right? And so that area is dying for laborers. So it's kind of a very uneven impact. But basically, overall in Japan has a problem of not enough skilled labor. And the more skilled work that you're looking for, the more there is a shortage. And Japan has been, kind of very, what's the word I want to say, proactively and very, clearly saying, we want highly skilled foreign labor to come to Japan. However, right now it's very difficult to bring people to work into Japan. But also, this whole experience is leaving a really bad taste in a lot of non-Japanese people's mouths, both of people who are living in Japan currently, and there are people who are saying, well, is this the place where I really want to be committing to, because it doesn't seem committed to me.
Yeah. You had that quote in your article from expert on the business in Japan, and talking about how Japan really should be taking care of its biggest fans. And
Exactly.
by doing all this bureaucratic nitpicking, you're tarnishing the image of Japan as a brand for where people want to come and work, right?
Right. So I thought the brand management take on it was really a important point, right? Because that's really what it's about.
Yeah, definitely. And diminishing the appeal for new talent. I think that's been happening over the years, but especially now with the extra paperwork and the extra requirements, which seem almost impossible, it's not going to help, is it? I have this image right now, a breakdown of industry by companies facing labor shortage in 2019 data. Hotel and restaurants is at the top. And I think during coronavirus, we have seen so many small businesses, restaurants, eateries, bars, small hotels really struggling. And I think that is probably, well, connected to labor shortage, but definitely connected to lack of customers, right?
Right, exactly. The lack of customers. People don't want to go out. They don't want to go to a lot of your restaurants in Japan are 3C type spaces. They're very small and enclosed and don't really feel safe right now.
Yeah. And a worrying thing is the second biggest labor shortage problem is the medical industry, the hospitals, the caregivers.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of information that hasn't come out yet about this year that we're really going to realize next year how bad it has been this year.
Right. Well, it was very interesting to me when, one of the big debates earlier this year, I mean, it's still an issue, but was why wasn't Japan doing more coronavirus testing? And one of the reasons that was given was lack of skilled people to administer the tests. So that's right there where you see the labor shortage is affecting that, right? And I would say it's probably not just labor shortage, but it's also lack of a flexible labor market. That it's very hard to quickly go out and hire people for something. In Japan, you don't have people with skills moving around, right?
Yeah. And I think there's also the recent news that Hawaii is opening up travel to Japanese visitors without the 2-week quarantine restriction. So now this changing the test parameters to people who are asymptomatic is going to have to change for Japanese people as well, I think, because before they go, they're going to have to get a negative test. So that could be a benefit for everyone, right?
Right, exactly. That would be nice. So it would be interesting to see if they do that, right? If there's enough people wanting to go Hawaii that they demand that.
Well, I'm from Hawaii, and that's one of the reasons I got into travel industry in Japan. And we know in Hawaii that Japanese visitors are not the biggest number of visitors, but they usually stay the longest and they spend the most money. So they're very important for the Hawaii economy. And I think I always suggest this when I talk to local destinations and stuff about tourism in Japan. We need to think about who's giving your area the most benefit and how do we cater to them. And I think that is kind of connected to this issue because I mean it's so hard not to say that the rules are not racist, because why is there a rule different for Japanese nationals and different for permanent residents who are not Japanese nationals, right? In terms of the virus. So in terms of tourism, you know, the Olympics, this was supposed to be the year of tourism, the year of huge investment in the tourism industry paying off for years, right? Yeah, crazy. Thank you everybody for joining. Looks like we have a bunch of people on Periscope. If you guys have any questions or comments, please make sure to write it below. We'll try to fit it in. Now, I have to give a shout out to Magdalena Osumi. She's been doing an amazing job covering this same topic on Japan Times. And she has had a few very good articles and also retweeted a lot of other articles from other journalists. So if you want to follow this, definitely follow Rochelle Kopp, but also Magdalene Osumi is well worth following her timeline. So the pledge issue I thought was really important that you talk about in your article. So people can't get the letter, which is part of the documentation needed for the paperwork, right?
Right, exactly. Because their sponsoring organization has to be willing to sign it.
And I think
some aren't. Yeah.
I think you mentioned in your article the Return to Japan support group, 30% hadn't had or had their university or company refused to sign. And then another 30% were still waiting for a response.
Right. And this was specifically of the subgroup of people who are in Japan already and are trying to bring a spouse.
Right. Yeah. Which is a big deal. If you're coming to live here, you want to bring your spouse or family.
Right.
It's a no-brainer.
It's completely natural and normal, right?
Yeah.
And the fact that, then companies would be like, no, we're not going to let you bring your spouse. I mean, that's you're getting into inhumane territory there, right?
Yeah. Have you had any interaction or any data or information about international students or international interns coming into Japan and their situation?
Well, I did do an article focusing on students and some of their challenges. I haven't heard anyone even thinking about internships, so I don't think that that's really a issue this year.
I think internships and what is it? There was a special kind of intern which was actually working, like working in oysters and stuff. And Hiko Simon.
For foreign technical trainees?
Yeah, maybe. Hiko Simon, thanks for joining. I have one of your articles that you posted the other day. 400,000 interns are currently in Japan. Did you see that one, Rochelle? I'll see if I can pick it up later. But I thought your article also so many of the issues, and then I was listening to you talk on business karaoke, excellent interview that you did, about wait, I'm gonna get it, Namawashi.
Namawashi, yes.
And I was thinking, Namawashi and what seems to be happening with the scientists on one side and the policymakers on the other seems counterintuitive. Am I just getting it wrong? Because can you explain Namawashi to us?
Certainly. So Namawashi is a business concept. And the idea of Namawashi is to be doing consensus building. And so it refers to the process of going around approaching key decision makers and sitting them down and really pitching them on your idea and getting them on board. And the idea is to do this in advance of any kind of meeting, to really be having things smoothed for everyone deciding on something, so that you don't have to have a big debate in the meeting. Everyone's already been convinced about it. And so this process of going around and talking to people is referred to as Namawashi. It's literal translation for going around the roots, and it was originally a word from the world of gardening, referring to a process for transplanting a tree, where Japanese gardeners would kind of dig out the roots in a careful way, maybe do it in a way that the tree would kind of come out of the ground in the right direction, giving careful attention to each part of the root system. And so that word started to get used in business for people who kind of try and pave the way for their decisions by carefully cultivating different decision makers.
Yeah, and I saw your article on Japan Intercultural website, and you were talking about how, of course, you explain it to the American audience, but you also often have to explain the origin to your Japanese audience as
Yeah,
well.
that people aren't always familiar with where it comes from, right?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes for Japanese, it has kind of a negative image, right? Um, it's because it sounds like sneaking around in the shadows a little bit, I think, for Japanese. But really, it refers to just the idea of approaching people individually and talking about stuff. And a
And
lot of times in American business, we would call it socializing an idea.
yeah,
Same sort of
I
thing.
thought it was really interesting, and I thought, does this problem that we're having now, is it just one person deciding these policies, like 72 hours, or we're not going to allow permanent residents to have the same rights, or is it Nemawashi, or are they abandoning this idea and it's just one person in power? I mean, what's
It's
your
really
take?
hard to say because the Japanese ministries that decide these things are black boxes. But they do seem to be doing it in an internally driven way. And I don't see a lot of emphasis of cultivating opinions from outside experts. I mean, it might be happening, but it's not apparent, right?
Yeah. So if they adopted Nemawashi, it might produce better, more proactive results.
Right,
So,
right. Well, then the thing is that Namawashi is part of an aspect of Japanese business that refers to the fact that people really don't like surprises in Japan, and they like to get prepared for things. And so when you do Namawashi with someone, you're basically giving them a heads up. And so that they know what's going to be happening, and they know what they're going to need to be weighing in on. They understand what the background is, and so that they're prepared. And in Japanese culture, that's the ultimate in showing respect for someone, is enabling them to know what's going to happen and let them get ready for it. If you think about what happened with this pledge, where this incredibly complicated, onerous, and weighty commitment that companies were expected to make got plopped on them suddenly, there was absolutely no Namawashi. So that was part of the problem. Because a lot of companies, as you heard from that statistic, 30% of for the people with spouses that they're waiting to bring are trying to figure it out. When they have to talk about it, and they have to give it due consideration, and they have to have meetings, which, if you're asking an organization to make this kind of commitment, it's not unreasonable that they would want to think about it, but they didn't have any kind of heads up. There was no Namawashi.
yeah.
And so that just means everyone has to wait longer.
So bring it back. Bring back the Nemawashi back into play. We had some interesting comments here. Hiromasa Shimamoto, thanks for joining from YouTube. Says Nemawashi sounds like the polar opposite of agile, lean, and customer-centered business design.
Oh, that is an interesting point. Mm. I hadn't thought about it that way. I think for Japanese ears, it's kind of because it kind of sounds old-fashioned, right? But I don't think it's necessarily incompatible. Because with agile and lean, you want to be, getting people on board and making things happen. And if Nemawashi is the way to do that efficiently, that's great, right? So if it works, it's not a problem, I would think. It just depends what your organization is culturally comfortable with. In the United States, where I'm from, a lot of people are really comfortable. Just get in a meeting and talk about it there, right? But that doesn't work in every culture, right?
Yeah, interesting. Sabrina also says, I've been told to use Namawashi to socialize an idea.
Yeah, yeah. That's it. Basically, that's what it is. Yeah, socializing an idea.
And Hiko Simon says, right, the stakeholders who get to participate in those government committees are key.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I found the article. 410,000 apprentices. So, apprenticeship visa work sites
Hmm.
found more than 70% in breach of law with things
Oh,
like
yes, yes.
unsafe conditions, illegal and unpaid overtime.
Right.
410,000 currently in the country on this visa type.
Right. That particular visa type is extremely exploitative. Exploitive. I mean, I can't even pronounce it right, but it exploits people, right? It's the huge amount of labor violations, and so it really is amazing that the Japanese government allows this particular visa type to continue to exist without having some kind of enforcement or to do something about just the rampant illegal treatment of people who come in on it. I mean, and you just hear just wrenching stories of people who are just overworked and abused in these situations to the point of becoming ill or suicidal. It's really bad. And so it's just a way to it's a it's quote unquote apprenticeships, but it's really just a cover to have cheap labor. And and in a way, I feel like the Japanese government, likes to have these labels and have these programs, and it's not being upfront about what it really is, right? And it's bringing in low cost labor, and it's allowing companies to do to do illegal things while doing it, and it's not good.
Yeah, it really struck me when I saw this in comparison to what we're talking about because we have people who are here, like foreign students or interns or apprentice or whatever you want to call them, and we could access this labor for the needs of the labor shortage during coronavirus right now, especially on the front lines. And front lines, I would include convenience stores, which there is an excellent article about how convenience stores in Japan are only being held up by foreign students or international um, people working in convenience stores around Japan. So very connected. A lot of these topics.
Right, right, exactly. And it just seems like when the Japanese government had to hurry this spring and put in this travel ban, that it just didn't really consider this whole group of people and what would be fair or appropriate or work well for them. And doesn't seem to be willing to go back and admit that the first approach wasn't really so good, and so that just seems to be kind of digging the hole deeper.
Yeah. And I think, like when I was listening to your conversation on business karaoke, um, so many of those things kept popping up, and I was like, oh, we have to talk about that. That's connected. That's connected. I think all your points from the article, I think we may have covered the thing about doctors being unwilling to fill out or sign the paperwork in foreign countries.
Well,
And
it depends how your medical system works, right? And so, I one of the people I interviewed for the article who's in Canada, I didn't even have time to include this, but there's a whole thing that you can't get a coronavirus test unless you have an Alberta, Canada medical number. And if you're not a resident, you wouldn't have that number. And so then he had to apply for the number. And then you can't even have a doctor's appointment if you're not part of the system. So the idea that someone can just walk into a doctor and get something taken care of maybe is possible in Japan, but there's a lot of places where it's not possible based on how the medical system is set up, right? Also, a lot of the ones in the United States, they give you the results of the tests, and it's an email that you get. And Japan is kind of conceptualized as you go to a clinic and there's a doctor there who's going to sign stuff for you, and that's just not how medicine works in a lot of places, right?
yeah. And there were loads of other really interesting points you brought up. such as you can't get the test if you're healthy in most places, even Japan. This is true. You can't get the result in time. Usually, that 72 magical number. Usually, it's 3 days to 6 days is the usual turnaround. And then even the test is a non-compatible type of test with what Japan would accept.
In some cases, yes. In some places are using, Japan specifies they need a certain type of test. And so there was a report from someone came from China and had a lot of trouble trying to find a place in China that was going to give her a test report in English. And she showed up in Japan. They said, "Oh, sorry, that's the wrong type of test." It's very frustrating for people, I think.
Even in her case, even when she was given a test on landing and it was negative,
yeah, exactly. Even
right?
For that gal, her test on landing was negative, but her pre-departure test wasn't the right type, so they sent her back.
It's not logical.
It's definitely not logical. It's just following bureaucratic rules to a T, but when the rules themselves aren't logical, it's extremely frustrating, right?
Yeah.
There was also someone on Twitter, and she wasn't willing to kind of go on the record, but she had put out a tweet that her husband, who is not Japanese, was coming from, was coming from the U.S. to Japan, and I forget what it was. Instead of saying negative, his test results said none detected, and the immigration agent would not accept that as being a negative test. So it's like, okay, we're lacking a little bit of English skill here, but that's the level that it's at, and each person in the chain, each immigration agent or each person at each embassy is completely empowered to make decisions on their own, and they can be inconsistent.
Yeah, you did touch on that quite a lot with on Business Karaoke about flexibility and the lack of training, and we're going to touch on that, of course, when we're talking more about servant leadership, right?
Right.
Erin says, my friend in Italy had to wait in line for 13 hours yesterday at a clinic and pay €70 just to get a coronavirus test.
13 hours? Oh my gosh, that's crazy. And then, of course, if you're standing in a clinic line for 13 hours, you're at risk of exposing yourself to catching something.
Yeah.
It's so frustrating.
It's really frustrating. Molly says, in the U.S., some states don't have enough tests and can't even test people with symptoms. I think that is the argument in many, many countries, including Japan. It's very difficult to get a test without symptoms. But I showed earlier, there is a recent news story saying the person in charge now wants to offer tests to people who are asymptomatic. We'll see if it happens. It's a good idea. Yeah. Richard says that would have nothing to do with language ability, but that would be their policy. I'm not sure which part you're referring to.
Probably referring to the negative versus not detected.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but if someone didn't put it in the policy that those mean the same thing, that's kind of, again, showing lack of knowledge of common medical terminology in other countries, right?
Yeah. Your specialist that you talked to for your article from Keio University, he also said he thinks experts are very unclear on the reason for the 72-hour choice. Like why?
Oh, well, that was Suji Sensei. That was the visa expert. He had said that. Yeah, that he's like he has no idea what the basis is for 72 hours. It has not been made clear.
Okay, Sergey says in Germany you can get tested for free, at least for the moment, and without any reason in particular. And you get your test results in about 48 hours.
Wow.
So Germans who would like to come back to Japan, if you have a permanent residency, you would be able to work it out. I've heard so few cases where people have been able to do it within the parameters, right? Hiko Simon says, I think anyone in Japan can pay for a private test, but it's about 30,000 yen. Is that true? I haven't heard of that. I'd love a link if you have one, Hiko.
Well, that's the other thing that something like that seems to be the going rate for testing in a lot of places. And so for a lot of people who've been asked to do the 72-hour test, they're paying another, 30,000 or 40,000 or sometimes 50,000 yen equivalent. And that's really burdensome for a lot of people. It's not a small amount of money that people are being asked to spend
No, definitely
for
not.
something that doesn't really make sense. That's what's so frustrating about it.
Yeah. I was really interested when you were talking about psychological safety in the workplace.
Okay, yeah.
And
So completely switching topics
it
here. We're
it's
leaving
it's
the travel
switching.
ban topic.
It's
Okay.
switching, but I did think that for international residents of Japan, that there are connections to that idea about your workplace, but about your home as well. So we'll circle back. Don't worry, we will
Okay.
circle back.
Okay. I just want to make it clear for the listeners.
Yeah, yeah. Can you introduce
So let
the?
me talk about the idea of psychological safety. So psychological safety is a concept that was actually developed by a Harvard professor. And it was kind of discovered a few years ago by Google because Google was doing some internal research. They were trying to identify what made their best teams their best teams. And their original hypothesis was the teams that have the best people on it must be the most productive or most successful. And they found, looking at the data, that that wasn't true. And if anyone is a sports fan, you know that just because a team has the best players doesn't mean they win the tournament or the series, right? So same thing with work teams. And so Google was trying to figure out, well, what makes the successful work team successful? And they noticed that those teams had meetings that were very different than other teams. And so the most successful teams, people spoke out freely with crazy ideas, different opinions, talked about problems, admitted mistakes, and they could say any of these things and not be afraid that people were going to shun them or make fun of them or criticize them or shut them down. And so, because of that, people could talk about problems openly, or they could suggest something that maybe seemed weird, but actually maybe was a good idea. And so, they were like, there's what's this openness? What do we call it? And then they did some research and they found this gal at Harvard who had studied this and called it psychological safety. And I've been really interested in it because I feel like it's a really helpful concept in Japan. Because sadly, a lot of workplaces in Japan lack psychological safety due to hierarchy, due to peer pressure, due to kind of entrenched negativity, right? Due to fear of being blamed for problems if you talk about them, being fear of, kind of kill the messenger syndrome, right? And so for all these reasons, a lot of Japanese organizations have no psychological safety or very poor psychological safety. So I found in my consulting work that it's a really great shorthand way to start talking about these concepts. So in a seminar or team building that I'm doing, I will share what I just shared about this in a little bit more detail about the story of how Google discovered psychological safety, and there was actually someone who had studied it, blah, blah, blah. And here's what the concept is. And then I'll ask people, so do your teams have psychological safety? And if they don't, why not? And how can we get more psychological safety? And those are questions that start to lead people to talk about real issues that are really important. And coming in at it with the foreign concept is I find just as a good angle to get people to be open to talk about it. So I've just found it's a really effective tool, and it's just a really effective concept. But I find it's a really effective tool when I'm working with corporate groups. Well, Well, yeah, one of the articles that I did for the Japan Times this spring talked about, kind of this topic for a lot of non-Japanese this spring were feeling kind of out of sync with their Japanese colleagues because a lot of non-Japanese were following international news and things were horrible in Italy and New York and places like that, and people in Japan seemed kind of nonchalant. And a lot of non-Japanese are like, hey, maybe we need to be like working from home, or maybe we should not be having like meetings in the same room. And there were a lot of people who were uncomfortable and who felt this lack of psychological safety for speaking up and speaking out about things. I mean, the other thing that comes to mind for me is one of the things that sort of happened to me this year for various reasons is I got into a bunch of dust-ups with Japanese right-wingers on Twitter. And they purposefully try to create an atmosphere where there is no psychological safety because they will go and bash anyone who says stuff that they don't like, right? And they've been targeting it at Naomi Osaka as well. And obviously, and lots of people get targeted by them, but that's just another relatable example. But it's just been very interesting and frankly kind of depressing to see how they are able to shut down a lot of discourse in Japanese on the internet because they are so relentless.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, no one's going to shut me up. I just blocked like a lot of people. I did a lot of
Oh,
blocking.
it's the blocking tool is so useful. Sorry guys, I did have my audio off for a few of my seconds there. I'm back. Thank you for telling me that my audio was off. So I think this might work well into you talking about servant leadership. What do you think?
Certainly, yeah.
Yes.
So that's people probably see me tweeting about that and like, what is she talking about, right? And so this is another thing. I've just had in my consulting work for a long time, I've had a real interest in how to change the dynamics of um, leadership in a Japanese context. And I got interested in this topic originally from working with Japanese firms' operations in the United States, where a recurring issue was we'd have Japanese managers who would come to the United States and yell at people or tell someone in a meeting in front of all their colleagues that was stupid, right? In other words, total non-psychological safety stuff. But I got really interested in this idea of why is it that Japanese managers are behaving in this way when they're coming to the United States. And obviously it's not all managers, but it was a certain subgroup, and it was often enough that it was an issue that our firm often gets called in. We'll get what I call the 911 calls from the HR manager who says, hey, I've got an expatriate who's screaming at people. Can you come and get him to stop doing that? Because if he doesn't stop doing that, we're going to have a lawsuit, and we're going to have to send him back to Japan. So let's change his behavior. Can you do that? So we actually do that. It's not like a service I can really advertise, but it's fairly popular, and we are very good at actually helping people change that behavior. Anyways, that's how I got interested in this whole issue. And so I've written in Japanese on how to be more effective manager. And I think a lot of cases for the people who yell, part of it is having bad models. If you've been always managed that way, then you think that's the way to manage. But it's also lacking skills for example, giving negative feedback, etc. And so I got interested in this I've been interested in how to be more effective managers. And then recently I've been doing a lot of work related to agile software development. A few years ago, someone from Microsoft had asked me to work with them to look at how Japanese organizations can be more successful implementing agile. And particularly he wanted my help because he felt that there was a organizational cultural issue. And when we analyzed the organizational cultural issues that were blocking agile, one of them was this old-fashioned, command and control, top-down, hierarchical, I'm the boss, I'm going to tell you what to do approach, which is obviously kind of the opposite of what you need for agile. And so in the US and a lot of workplaces that are doing agile, this idea of servant leadership has become very popular because that's really the approach that makes a better environment for agile. So I started looking at that through this agile work and realized that this was an alternative model. Because I felt like so many of the Japanese managers and leaders that I worked with were looking for something different. That they didn't want to be the manager like their manager, who they had worked under, right? And and I incredible stories. I was talking about this once with one of my Japanese clients, who's a guy about my age, and he says, "Yeah, there's all these issues, but it's a lot better than it was. When I was younger, my boss used to throw his ashtray at me." And not just once, this was like a regular occurrence. He's like, at least no one's throwing ashtrays anymore. But still, if that was your model, it's hard to get out of that, right? So I have so many Japanese I work with who they don't want to be like the boss that they had. But then what do you be? What can you be? What is your new model? And I feel like servant leadership really works well for that. And another group that I find that servant leadership works really well for is Japanese women. Because a big issue, we talk a lot about how Japanese companies are not putting enough women in management, and that we could have a whole talk just about that. It's a complicated issue. But one of the things that's a recurring theme is that a lot of Japanese women don't want to become managers. And partially that's because they don't want to be overworked, because often there's so much responsibility that you have as a manager, and then it becomes very difficult to balance that with your home life. But also, when I talk with a lot of Japanese women, they have a visceral aversion to becoming a manager because they don't want to be like any of the managers that they've ever had. And so I'm finding with Japanese women, if you can say, here is a different model for how you can be a manager that's more appealing to you and you feel more comfortable with, that I think can help Japanese women get over the issues with becoming a manager, if they can have a different conception for how to be a manager. And I feel like servant leadership works really well for that. So that's why I've been interested in it. So anyways, I've been talking about it, but I haven't defined it. So let me define it. So the idea of servant leadership is that literally the leader is a servant to their team, that they're there to help them out and support them. So it's the opposite of, I'm here to tell you what to do and control you. Instead, the idea is, you guys and gals who are doing the work, you know exactly what to do. You are experts in your field, and I'm going to make an environment that makes it easier for you to get your job done. And I'm going to give you feedback, and I'm going to listen to what issues you're encountering and help to solve them. And I'm going to deal with other parts of the organization and kind of run interference for you. And so the analogy I like to use is that a servant leader is like an Olympic athlete's coach, because the athlete is able to perform better doing that work than the coach is. And maybe the coach did that type of sport at some point in the past, but now maybe their body is just not going to do that anymore. And maybe they weren't even ever really that good as the Olympic athlete is now. But what they are good at is helping an Olympic athlete perform to their best. And so coaches will plan training schedules, will advise on technique, will advise on diet, all sorts of things, and be watching that athlete perform, give them positive feedback when they're doing well, be a shoulder to cry on if there's issues, help them pick themselves up and then get back on when they've had their troubles, and support them in so many ways. And that kind of supportive presence is what a servant leadership should really be like, right? So it's a completely different idea about how to be a leader. There are, because this is a concept that actually is like 40 or 50 years old already. It's not that new. It's not new. It's been around for a while, and because of that, there have been a ton of people who have studied it. And so there are a lot of people who did their doctoral dissertations on servant leadership. And so there's a great amount of compelling data that shows that the more you have servant leadership in an organization, higher your sales, higher your profits, your teams are more effective, your employees are more happy and engaged, you're more creative, you have better customer service. All the stuff that companies are trying to do, this is a way to make it happen. And it just requires changing your mindset. It doesn't require, buying millions of dollars of new equipment or something like that. So it's very, I think so I can teach it to people with confidence, knowing that there's a lot of, backup that shows that it actually really is impactful.
That's awesome. We've had some great comments, and it really reminds me of the idea of a teacher that works with students as well, not
Yeah.
just the top down, listen to me, do what I say, repeat what I say. It's more like I'm doing it with you. What do you think? And very engaging and more. You have respect, but you're like you had a great graphic of the leader being part of the team, pulling
Right.
a big rock instead of just saying you pull the rock, right?
Right, exactly.
Hiromasa says, I knew I wanted to be different from the managers I had. I'm hands off and trust that the people I hire know their onions. Sometimes they mess up, but we review and learn. I don't shout ever.
Wonderful.
That's awesome. Erin says, best manager I ever had, let me do my thing, but was always there for my questions. So when I needed it, I knew I could and would reach out when I needed it. So that's awesome.
Perfect. That would be a servant leader type approach, yes.
Fantastic. Sabrina says, I can't believe that people are actually doing that. I think we're talking about psychological safety. I can't believe people are actually doing that. It sounds like those managers need better interpersonal skills.
Oh, the ones who are yelling, yeah. Unfortunately, there's a lot of it. There's a lot of it, and unfortunately, it's become a worse problem in Japan. I mean, now actually there is a category in Japan called power harassment. It's a legal concept that in the United States, it's called bullying or abusive behavior. But in Japan, there's actually a law against it. But even though there's a law against it, it's still unfortunately rampant. And surveys show that huge numbers of people have experienced abusive behavior at work. And I think it's gotten worse in recent years because as the Japanese economy has gotten worse, managers are under a lot of pressure, and then they kind of take it out on their subordinates. And it's awful, but unfortunately, so many organizations turn a blind eye to it. The other problem that you have in Japan is that there isn't psychological safety to go to HR and complain about it, because if you're the complainer, then you get branded as being the problem. But also, you don't have a fluid labor market. Because what you have happening in countries with fluid labor markets is if you have a boss who's a total jerk, all the people who work for him or her quit, or a lot of them quit. And you don't have that mechanism working in Japan. So people who hate their boss don't quit, they just are miserable. And they tough it out, they gaman, right? But that removes a mechanism that kind of forces that person to change, or that brings their existence of being a problem that makes it obvious, right?
So if people have horrible managers, can they nominate them to join your course and get some training?
Yes, in fact, I did a servant leadership class just the other day, and one of the people said, I got sent. yeah. So
Oh,
I thought
good.
it was really funny that he said it, but yeah, he got sent. So yes, people do get sent, and I do hear great stories of people tell me later, wow, someone came to your seminar and his behavior is now 180 degrees different. So I love hearing stories like that. So, I mean, I can't guarantee, but I can definitely give someone some new ideas and some new techniques.
Well, I connected back to COVID. This gives me hope because if you're training managers to listen to their staff, to work with their staff, that's what we need for innovation, entrepreneurship, but that's also what we need to fix problems like the pandemic.
Right, to fix problems like COVID, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much. So you've got an upcoming seminar. Do you want to announce about that?
Oh yeah, so I've got a couple different things. Well, I've got a couple things coming up for Japanese, and so I have next I guess it's a week from Saturday. Going to have a Working with Americans short seminar on Saturday, and I think it's either at 11 a.m. or noon or something like that. So it's for something for people to do outside of work hours, and it's just an hour. I also, for people who are in the U.S., I have my team members are doing Working Effectively with Americans full-day seminars online in November, and then we're also having some Working Effectively with Japanese full-day seminars online in the U.S. It probably won't be till first quarter, but I'm going to be doing some more open seminars in Japan online as well. And just I've just been so busy here, I haven't been able to organize some, but we'll look at doing some more in Japan. Also, I do a monthly, what I call the Servant Leadership Dojo for Japanese leaders. A lot of them are people who have already come to one of my seminars. However, if you sign up for it, you also get to use for free my on-demand version of the servant leadership training. So some people sign up and then they just do the online training, and then it's monthly meetings, and it's very reasonable. It's 2,500 yen a month, and so and we have a meeting one Saturday morning a month, and then it's a chance to really discuss and to work on skill building, and we go in depth into certain topics. When you join, you can view the past sessions videos, and also if you can't make it that particular Saturday, you can just watch the video. It's always posted. So that's kind of a cool thing. If you know a Japanese manager who wants to get into this topic, it's only 2,500 yen a month, so it's very reasonable. That cost is not a barrier.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And such a big help to organizations, and also hopefully government people will start coming and get some good training. I also want to give a shout out to your activities with cleanup in Fukuoka. So
Yes.
you've been joining the FFS in Fukuoka, the team,
Yes.
and you guys have a cleanup coming up in November, right?
Right. Yeah. The next one's November 28th. So it's usually at the end of the month. I think in December, though, it's going to be a little closer to the middle of the month. So they restarted them. They had been kind of off for Corona because we didn't want to gather people together, but now it's an outside activity, and so we kind of feel like we can, we all mask up, etc. Yeah, so we go out to Shikanoshima, and there's a certain beach there that a lot of stuff washes up because it's right where stuff is coming in from out on the open ocean. And there's a lot of junk out there, and so every time you go, there's plenty to clean up, and
Yeah.
it's one, of course, it's a environmentally conscious great thing to do, and you can do. Sometimes it just feels really good to just do something concrete, right? And it's also a friendly group, and it's fun. It's very social, and we chat while we're picking up stuff up. And also, at least for me, I feel as sore the next day as if I had done a major CrossFit workout.
It's a good workout.
It is a very good workout, yes. And so for so you can get in shape and do something, to help the environment at the same time, right?
And it's not too hot now this time of year,
Right,
so
right. We
yeah.
had beautiful weather for it. Yeah, it was great. It's not too hot.
And
Yeah,
good for
it's
you.
nice.
I know it's an overwhelming problem, but doing a little bit, every little bit helps. So thank you so much for your efforts. And thank you for all you're doing with training and everything. We have one last comment from Silver Star. He says he's a business owner in Japan, in Osaka. So if you're interested in Rochelle's training, definitely reach out through her website. And you're on all the social media, I believe. Rochelle Kopp on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter,
Yeah.
anything you can imagine.
Although
You
I
can
have
find
to
her.
admit, like, I never opened my Instagram. I kind of gave up on that one. So don't send me a message there. I probably won't see it, and you'll notice my content on there is not very fresh. I couldn't like do everything, and I kind of just sort of
Yeah.
Instagram. I feel like if you're going to do it well, it needs a lot more time and energy than I really have. So I kind of concentrate on the Twitter. That's my main one.
Twitter is very easy to get in touch, yeah. And then through your website's excellent, and you have a
Right,
lot
right.
of
Thanks. And it has a contact page on it. Yeah.
great information there. Thank you everybody for joining. I put up a load of great comments along the way. Thank you so much. Sorry I didn't have time to read everybody's out. Join us tomorrow morning as we talk to Matt and Hiroko about Japanese ghosts. just in time for Halloween. So join us 9 a.m. tomorrow. I'm glad it's daylight because it's going to scare me. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you so
Okay,
much,
thanks so
Rochelle.
much.